I want to thank Scott and Tom Long. I've known Tom almost 18 years. He's an aircraft fanatic, and so am I. The area that I'm going to be covering is, I'm a hardware person, and I got into the unexplained phenomena purely by accident, through osmosis, and just through the fact that the government way back when, almost 20 years ago, chose to ignore my legitimate requests for information on unclassified portions of classified programs. And it was with that total disregard for my request as an American taxpayer that I started doing a lot of digging. I do have, as I get into my talk, and it will not be Linda Moulton Howe type of presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I am absolutely honored to follow her in the presentation. I don't have any visuals, but I have been exposed to a lot of people both before and after they have gone public. Two of those individuals, and I'll get into it later, is I've known John Lear, who I think he was here last year. I've known John Lear about 15 years. I knew him when he thought that UFOs were a big joke. He said, "Don't talk to me about UFOs, they don't exist." I've known Bob Lazar since before he went to work at S4, and when he thought that UFOs were a joke also. And I'll get into that a little bit later. My area, again, I started out as a Blackbird fanatic. I saw my first Blackbird in 1964. And I felt it was important that I find out as much as I could on that program. Like most every black program in the Air Force, they try to compartmentalize it. They try to keep it from those of us that want to know more about it, not necessarily on a capability standpoint, but on the, I'm an aviation buff. I build model aircraft. I take photographs of military aircraft, and I try to find out as much as I can from the historical point of view or the technical point of view, not necessarily mission profile. And starting in about 1975, I made a number of major inquiries to the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, Lockheed, Air Force, and just DoD in general for some basic information, basic photographs, color, 8x10s of the Lockheed SR-71. The official response was, "We're not going to cooperate with you. It's not, you don't have the right to know." And starting with that, that's really what got my, the hair in the back of my neck up. The government works for the people, not, they don't have a little country club that belongs to themselves. So I started digging. What I requested initially wasn't classified then, it's not classified now. And so, sort of poetic justice. We have a Blackbird in Minneapolis, which I brought in last October. So it's sort of, all this stonewalling over the years didn't really prove itself out. But in the process of trying to dig up information on the Blackbird, I had the pleasure of meeting John Andrews in the Tester Corporation. John and I go back to about 1974. He is a person who is one of the more intelligent people I've ever had the honor of knowing. He is a determined person, much like myself. When he asks a question of the government, he won't back off, even when they say, "No, we're not going to tell you." We started doing a lot of fun things together, sharing information, sharing sources. We never ever divulged who our sources were when we were looking for information on black programs. But as time went on, he said, "There's someone who lives in Las Vegas who I think you should get to know, because he is he's from an aviation family. He's an aviation enthusiast, and he shares your love of aircraft." And it turned out to be John Lear. And back in 1976, when I first met John, UFOs again were just a joke. But we were starting to spend some time out in the Nevada desert looking for things that go bump in the night, things that were unexplained, things that the government wouldn't talk about, or if you did mention them, they would clam right up. And in 1977, John Lear, John Andrews, and myself started hearing rumblings about what was referred to as Have Blue. For those of you familiar with Stealth, that was the technology demonstrator that Lockheed built in 1977 and flew in very, very late 77, early 78 as the predecessor to the F-117 Stealth. And we started hearing about the aircraft in 1977. 11 years later, the government announced the existence of the F-117 flying out of the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada. 1982, through sources, through John Lear, through other people I know within Nevada in the construction industry, we started hearing reports about a very, very large construction project, the largest construction project in the Nevada test site in recent history. As it turns out, this secretive place that they were working on, this secret construction project, was the Tonopah Test Range. It consists of 64 hangars, of which 60 of them are suitable for F-117 operations. And it was built over a period of about 6 years, headed up, I believe EG&G did a lot of the major construction there. But here, the information is starting to filter out. We're getting the description of what's flying out there, bits and pieces. We heard that it was faceted. We heard that from a distance, it looked like a Mirage F1. There was no round corners on the aircraft, and we started getting these small bits and pieces. It was powered by General Electric engines. As it turns out, working with Bill Sweetman, who is a technology editor for Janes. He lives in St. Paul, and I live in Minneapolis. So we have a sort of a little concentration of stealth knowledge in the Twin Cities area, that we started getting more and more bits and pieces on the F-117. And it was like a blind man describing an elephant. You weren't sure at what point or what part of the aircraft that person was describing, but all the pieces started to fit in. And as I look back, last night I was here for a bit listening to the speakers, and they were talking about bits and pieces in a big puzzle. And I think what we're seeing on the unexplained phenomena is, again, that blind man describing an elephant, where we're getting little bits and pieces. And when we see the entire picture, when we see the entire, when it does become, when it is presented to us, we will see, really what has been being described over the last 40 some odd years. But to get back to the F-117, John Lear and I were doing a lot of digging, wandering around the Nevada desert, and in November 1988, it was November 10th, 1988, the Air Force announced the existence of the F-117. And they announced that the aircraft would start to be flown during the day. So I believe that was on a Monday or Tuesday, and that was on a Monday. On Tuesday, John Lear and I drove out to Tonopah Test Range. We were going to see this place for ourselves. And those of you who have spent any time in the Nevada desert, who've had the joy of driving either to the back door at Groom Lake or to the northern fence line of Tonopah, it is in the middle of nowhere. You can literally take off and land anything known to fly in that area, and you wouldn't bother a soul. It is approximately 40 miles from the town of Tonopah, which is about 6,200 people. They've lived with black programs and nuclear weapons research for the last 40 years, and their town one time was a thriving silver town. Now it survives on supporting DoD activities. The Tonopah local paper will have ads for security guards with a Q clearance or higher, and you're not going to find that in your normal everyday newspaper. So they do live and survive on supporting the Department of Defense and the United States government. No one in that town is willing or ready to talk about what's flying out of the Nevada desert. They'll grunt at you, they'll turn their back on you, they'll walk away, and with the F-117 black up until November, it was a normal occurrence to them to see the airplane fly over. But John and I decided we were going to go and take a look at, see what we can see. So we drove there on a Tuesday, and it turns out we missed it by 1/2 hour. And we spent from about noontime until almost 2 o'clock in the morning waiting for this airplane to overfly us. It was middle November, and it was cold. And I'm from Minnesota, but it was cold up there. It's about 6,000 feet. Nothing to keep the wind from blowing through you. Next day, we decided we'd go out there first thing in the morning. We waited around and nothing. So John was a little bit discouraged, and he had to get back to town to go fly somewhere. So we decided we're going to go head towards Warm Springs, which is due east on US 6, go down 375. And John said, there's a road that I want to go down. It'd been a long time since he'd been down it. and we'll see what happens. So we went through the town of Rachel, got gas, and about 20 miles southeast of Rachel is they call the Groom Lake Road, or the dirt road, or the back door to Groom Lake. For those of you who haven't been out there, it's a 4-lane dirt road heading due west into the mountains just north of Bald Mountain. It's from the main road to the guard shack, which is relatively new, is 15 miles. And John and I are driving down this dirt road in a rent-a-car. It was a Cadillac Seville that we were using as a Jeep. I'm sure the rental car company was real thrilled. I could smell sagebrush for almost a week after we brought it in. But an A7 Corsair 2 buzzed us. We were about mile 7 on this dirt road. Buzzed us at 30 feet on the ground. We figured about 500 knots. It almost knocked the car off the road. John and I both jumped out, and our hearts are just beating, almost out of our body. That's the most thrilling thing we'd seen all week. And the valley floor is sort of dome-shaped, and the A7 actually went below the horizon for quite some distance. Then at the end of the valley, went straight up in a corkscrew, then flew over us, turned around, and went directly over Groom Lake. So we knew there was probably the A7s for the 4450th or some other support aircraft out of Groom Lake, because no one flies into the box unless they're authorized to do so. John and I continued down the road after our hearts quit pounding, and we had beads of sweat all over us because it was exciting. We got to a guard shack, and you could see the south end of Groom Lake. You can see the POL, the petroleum oil and lubrication storage facilities on the south end of the facility, the south end of the runway, but that was about it. As we came up to the guard shack, and it's a relatively good-sized shack with a 90-foot telephone pole in the front of it with a camera on top. I didn't realize it till later that was a TV camera. It might even be a low light level camera. And this very nice guard came out. He was a reject from the NFL because he was too big. He's in desert BDUs. He came out with his Beretta, and he unsnaps the flap over his Beretta and comes out and said, "May I help you?" And I said, "We're out for a drive." And he said, "Well, you can't go any farther." He says, "What are you doing down the road?" And I said, "It had to go somewhere. We wanted to find out where it ended." He said, "Well, it ends here." And about at that same time, a larger person comes out of the guard shack, and this man had a scowl on his face, and he's brandishing an M16 with a 30-round clip. I could see he took the safety off, the clip, he put the clip in, he came up, and they said, "I need some identification." So John Lear handed him his driver's license, and I handed him my Minnesota driver's license. He says, "What are you doing out here?" I says, "We're out just for a Wednesday drive." He said, "You're an awful long way from home." And we're just looking around, and another A7 flew over our head, and John asked the guard, he said, "Do you mind if I take a picture of the guard shack?" And the guard looked at us and said, "If you do, you'll be interviewed by some very, very unfriendly types." So we decided we weren't going to press the issue. We headed back to Las Vegas. The day before, we had photographed the Tonopah Test Range facility and did some hero shots of John and I standing in front of the fence. We got back to Las Vegas, and I didn't really want to go to the local photomat and have the film processed because it was the first photographs that I knew of that anyone had taken of the Tonopah Test Range. So John says, "Well, I have a friend of mine who has a photo processing unit at his home. I'll give him a buzz, and he'd be interested to see what we talked about." Says, because he's going to be going to work at the test site. I said, "Fine." So he made a phone call when we got home to John's house, and about an hour later, it was either a 240 or 260 Datsun ZX pulls up, and out of the car comes Bob Lazar. Bob came into the house. About the same time Bob came in the house, a black van pulled across the street on Hollywood Boulevard where John lives to observe us. And John introduced me to Bob Lazar, and we started talking about just a little bit of this and that. At the time, Bob had not gone to work in the Nevada test site. He had just left Sandia, where he worked on particle beam weapons and other nuclear weapons or SDI research. The man was just a lot of fun to talk with, and we had to go over to Bob's house to get the film processed. So we jumped in the car, just Bob and I, and we started heading off to the opposite end of town. It's about a 35-minute drive from John Lear's house. And I asked Bob, well, how'd you meet John? And Bob said through a mutual friend who's in the real estate business. I said, what do you think about his interest in unexplained phenomena or UFOs? And he laughs. He says, I like John Lear, and he's genuine, but I think his feeling towards UFOs is a little bit off course. He says, I'm a nuclear physicist. Unless I can put my hands on it and see it, it doesn't exist. You can talk about seeing lights in the sky, talking about people who have been abducted who may or may not be factual, but he said, until I put my hands on it and know for sure that UFOs exist, they don't. It's a bunch of baloney. Someone's blowing something out of proportion. So we got to Bob Lazar's house, and he's showing me pictures of his jet car. He has some newspaper clippings from the Albuquerque area showing his jet car. Again, that's what we were talking about, jet cars. I'm into fast cars and fast airplanes, and that's where the interest was. But the Albuquerque paper and the newspaper clippings that showed Bob Lazar, it says, Bob Lazar, working, who's a research engineer at the Sandia Labs in Albuquerque, there at Kirkland. Now this is original newspapers, not photocopies, but originals, telling me that this guy did indeed work at Sandia Labs, does have a jet car, he has it parked in his driveway, and is who he said he was. He didn't believe in UFOs. He thought they were a joke. They were someone wanted to drum up some publicity, and he was way beyond that. So we head back, another half-hour drive back to John Lear's house with the coverage of Tonopah, and we're talking a little bit more about UFOs, and Bob has convinced me that his feeling towards UFOs is they don't exist. There isn't anything that can convince him that they do exist. Got back to John's house, the black van came back almost as soon as we got inside the house, because we could look out the front windows there. And we looked at the photos that we'd shot, and the overall facility at Tonopah, it's huge. They spent $600 million on it, and it was just fascinating to see it for the first time. And the night went on, we talked a little bit more. Bob was indicating that he had applied for a job through EG&G to go to work in the Nevada test site to do some research. He didn't know what it was. He couldn't talk about it. The security people were very, very upset because he had become friends with John Lear, and that he really had to limit his exposure to John. And John understood that. It wasn't until about a year later when I came back to Las Vegas to visit John, to go back out in the desert to shoot F-117s, that John indicated that there were some things that were not right in the Nevada desert. Bob Lazar had indeed gone to work out of Groom Lake, and it wasn't something he wasn't going to cover at that particular time because things were too sensitive. But John was fearful for himself and fearful for Bob Lazar. So in August '89, I had a chance to photograph my first F-117, and it was an exciting experience. It was someone who loves airplanes and who likes things that are different and unusual, and the first person to see him, I believe I was one of the very first photographers to photograph the 117. And my heart was pounding real hard. Came back to Las Vegas, had the prints processed, and between the year that went by and when I went back in that August, Bob Lazar had gone public. He had talked with George Knapp, and I don't know all the exact time sequences, but I had a chance to go over Bob Lazar's house. John Lear and I went over there, and this is right after the FBI or whomever had gone in and raided his house and cleaned it out. He supposedly had bits and pieces of the craft. He had all his notes were taken, all his documents that support who he was were taken. And Bob was really, really scared. And I said, what makes you so scared? And he said, I become a non-person. Apparently, where he started getting very, very uncomfortable, and again, this is the first person from Bob to myself, where he started getting scared, is he went to get a birth certificate for some reason. And he contacted the hospital he was born in. They had no record of him. Contacted the county. There was no record. This started to bother him. He contacted MIT. Now, I'd seen some of the documentation he had. Well, he went to MIT because we were talking about a lot of the things the first night I met him. MIT had no report of him ever, no record of Bob ever going to school there. From 1989 back to his birth, he does not exist. And one of the things that really, really bothered Bob is when they start making you a non-person, then you can disappear and there's no trace. And shortly thereafter, that George Knapp got involved, started doing some investigation. And what George ran into, again, was a total denial of the fact that Bob ever existed anywhere. He couldn't find it. I mean, he couldn't find a trace anywhere. But he's very, very persistent, and he went off to Albuquerque to see for himself if he can dig up something. And that's when he did get the phone book, and with his name in it. And there was an article in the Sandia Labs employee newsletter that hadn't been sanitized, that hadn't been gone through and removed. And I believe he found it either in a public library in Albuquerque or Kirkland, and George Knapp could tell you where he found it, that showed a picture of Bob Lazar in front of his jet car, the one I had seen a copy of in 1988 when I first met Bob, talking about his involvement in weapons research Sandia. And he brought that up to the local authorities, and they, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand. For those of you who question Bob Lazar, you may still have your questions on Bob. I knew him before he went to work at the test range. I've known him since. I spent a day, almost 2 days with him this last February. The thing about Bob, his stories have been consistent. He is not out for, he hasn't made a cent on it. I mean, he's lost a $75,000 a year job, and his consulting business went down the toilet, and he was doing some work through a secondary source. And when the source found out, when the DOD agency found out that Bob was fixing this equipment, and it was some radiation detection equipment, they cut the contract off from this second party, and that other person who was funneling work through Bob has since been banned from doing government work. Bob is who he says he is. He's sincere. He went public to save his life, and I'm an honest believer of that because of the fact that I knew him before, during, and after. He doesn't want publicity. He was approached by a number of tabloids saying, okay, we'll give you X number of dollars or thousands of dollars, if we can get an exclusive. And he said, no, I don't want it. He told me, we were sitting down one afternoon, just him and I, and he said, if you could do this all over again, what would you do? And he said he would do it. He would have done absolutely nothing. He said he wishes today he could put the genie back in the bottle, but he can't. The genie's out. But he does not want or desire or relish publicity, and he's made no money off of it. And that's, and again, his stories have been consistent. So those of you who question Bob Lazar's authenticity, all I can say is what I've seen, first person, that he's real. But getting back to the Nevada desert, this last February 4th, John Lehr and I decided we were going to go see if we can find Aurora. That's the Mach 6 to Mach 8 airplane that you've been reading about lately. Aurora isn't a really good name for it. Everyone refers to it as Aurora as much as they referred to as the original stealth aircraft as F-19. F-19 never existed, but when you said F-19, everybody knew what you're talking about. The original funding for Aurora, as it appeared in 1986 Congressional Budget Review was money that was actually allocated for B2, and they put it into a separate category, codename Aurora. But the money stood out like a sore thumb, and people just assumed that the Mach 6 to Mach 8 aircraft, the hypersonic aircraft, was indeed called Aurora. The origins of Aurora go back to about 1982, when the rumblings around the Los Angeles area started, spotlight here, I confess. When the rumblings around the Los Angeles area started talking about a follow-on to the SR-71, and that's where my love is the Blackbird. And the prime contractors that were considered were, of course, Lockheed and Northrop. Talking to a friend of mine who worked at Rockwell in their public relations department, and his name's Eric Simonson. He's written a number of books. And he said that whatever you do, don't discount the capability of Rockwell, because don't forget, we do have orbital experience. You know, we have a fleet of orbiters that they built, or they were the prime contractor on. So they're used to aircraft going through the air at very, very high speeds. Lockheed, on the other hand, has the technical expertise to build aircraft employing 5,000 to 10,000 people and not a soul talk. And I find that absolutely amazing. The other people, some of the other players would be Boeing. Boeing has their advanced development group up in Seattle, has the ability to produce major subsystems for virtually anything in total secrecy. But the word started coming out, there's a new propulsion system under consideration. Rocketdyne and TRW were working on it, and that two prime contractors were the ones that were considered the serious contenders, and that was a Rockwell-Lockheed team. And it made sense, Lockheed knowing how to build them in the black world, and Rockwell knowing how to, having the expertise for building orbital type aircraft. Lockheed again having the expertise of building triple sonic aircraft in limited numbers. So the rumors kept persisting about this airplane. Bob Lazar, again, on one of his first or second trips to the test site, Groom Lake or Area 51, saw part of a vehicle getting ready to take off that he described as a door wedge with short stubby wings on it, or an X-15, like an American X-15 on steroids. The noise being overwhelming, the noise sounding as though the sky was ripping. The same description was given by another gentleman in an Aviation Week article, like 1989, 1990 timeframe, where he described the noise of what he heard and what he saw as the sky ripping. That's two people, not related, not working together, who have the same description. Other people that have heard noise in the Nevada desert, who are familiar with SR-71 operations, knows it's not like anything they've ever heard. Last October at Palmdale, now our Air Force Plant 42, located in Palmdale, California, is the manufacturing facility for the B-1, the B-2, the U-2 TR-1. It's the overhaul facility for the F-117, and there are more black programs being flown out of Palmdale, Air Force Plant 42 today than there ever was in the 1980s. In October of this last year, we had a team go to Palmdale to dismantle a Blackbird to put it into a C-5 and fly it back to Minneapolis. I left on a Saturday, but on that Sunday, the maintenance team chief, Andy Hofdahl, who's a senior master sergeant in the Air Guard, has 35 years aircraft maintenance, worked on jets, worked on transports, worked on a lot of systems, was at Lockheed Plant 10 at Palmdale with Lanny Jenkins, who's the plant manager. That's the new Skunk Works, by the way. They're moving the Skunk Works from Burbank to Air Force Plant 42, Lockheed Plant 10, which is off Air Force 42 property. And they were out looking at getting ready to load the engine nacelles of our Blackbird into another C-5, and there was sweepers going up and down the runway. And Lanny Jenkins made a comment and said, well, they're probably going to do something this afternoon. And Andy said, what? And he says, can't tell you. So they were in Lanny's office which is in a windowless building on the southwest corner of the facility. It's probably about 2.5, 3 miles away from the main runway. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Andy Hofdahl said he heard this incredible noise, something like he has never heard before, and he's heard solid rocket motors launch, he's heard liquid fuel rockets, he's heard the SR-71. He said this thing just rattled the windows. And it went on for about 2 seconds, and there was an explosion. It was a bang and dead silence. And Lanny Jenkins said, oh, screwed up another one. And he said, screwed up what? He says, no comment. Most of the black activity for the Air Force that operates out of Air Force Plant 42 operates on the weekends, holidays, at night. There's minimal people on the facility, and the local residents that just chose to ignore the activities of Air Force Plant 42. Much the same, the residents of Tonopah ignore the activities flying in out of Tonopah, and the people of Rachel, odd activities out of the Groom Lake facility are not a phenomenon to them. They're a normal occurrence. It's when they don't happen is when it's unusual. So the Air Force is flying, or not necessarily the Air Force, the government is flying something out of Palmdale. It's been reported they are flying something out of Groom Lake. The supersonic booms that have been hit off of Los Angeles on a regular basis, almost always Thursday mornings between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., and they believe it's a recovery profile because it's taken off from a different direction and it's decelerating coming in, and the track is into Groom Lake. It was with that in mind that NBC went out, it was 2 weeks ago, and had a film crew go out to the dirt road, to the Groom Road in Highway 375, and his orders were to stay there until he got something. And John Lear and Bob Lazar were out there that Wednesday night, and they waited until about 2 o'clock in the morning, nothing happened. They decided to go back to Vegas, and at 4 a.m., the NBC film crew, film person, did observe a set of lights take off from Groom Lake. Now, from the road, you have a small mountain range in between yourself and Groom. The mountains are about 1,000 feet above the lake level, so you can't see the facility, but you can see the lights, and the lights were very, very intense. He had a low light level camera, and an object took off and hovered, did some maneuvering, and then left. And it could be explained a number of different ways. It could have been a Black Hawk helicopter because they buzzed John and I when we were out there last time. It could have been a number of other things, but the film crew and the people who saw it are familiar with what flies out there as far as conventional aircraft, and they figured there was something flying out of there. To back up a ways, I have a real strong involvement in black programs. I spent a lot of time at the fence line at Tonopah and in the valley outside of Groom Lake, and I try to keep my ears and eyes open, but I also know a number of people in the Pentagon. One of them, his name is Pete Ames, and it's E-A-M-E-S. He is Program Security Manager for Special Projects for the Air Force. And my first direct involvement with Pete was when I was called up for Desert Shield. They were holding up my clearance because I was sticking my nose into too many things. And I've become not friends with him, but associates with Pete, and he considers myself as a friendly adversary. I had a phone call from Pete Ames on the 22nd of April of this year about a number of things. One, my access to Groom Lake. They're citing Title 18 about, I think it was 1950 vintage, that if you photograph the Groom Lake facility or facilities that have been designated by the President as national security centers, that you can get a $1,000 fine or a year in jail or both. And John Lear and I had photographed the Groom Lake facility on February 4th of this year. And I was doing a little bit of battle with Pete, and he called me in regards to that. And we started doing some talking, and he said, Jim, do you do me a favor? And I said, what's that? He says, do you know anything about what's booming the state of California? I said, well, I have some theories. Why? He said, I have been asked by my boss, Colonel Barry Hennessy, who heads up Special Projects OSI, the Pentagon, to try to find out what is making the noise, because it's not coming out of their office. What I found kind of strange until you realize that real black programs, the employer that employed Bob Lazar, the United States Navy. Back in the 50s and 60s, the real black programs were headed up either by the CIA, or if it was a military operation, it was the Army. Yeah, that has since been transferred to the Navy, and the Navy is responsible for the operations at S4 that Bob has referred to, and some very other spooky operations in the Nevada desert, both in weapons test and in unexplained activity in the Nevada desert. So it would be possible that special projects, in the room number is 5D156, for those of you who have an opportunity to go to the Pentagon, you may want to buzz the buzzer and go in and talk to Pete. I think you'd be thrilled. Tell him Jim sent you. He said that the Air Force, and that's all he handles is just the Air Force, has no hypersonic vehicles flying today. And in 5 years from April 22nd in 1997, said he'll buy me a cup of coffee and he'll show me what they don't have. And he's told me that he would not lie to me, and he hasn't in the past. If it was something that I wasn't supposed to know, he'd tell me it's none of your business, or I can't comment, or not even answer. But he's always been very honest with me when he could answer. My question was, am I currently under investigation? He said, as of this moment, no. So that means that maybe later on in the day I was, but not at that particular moment. So the Aurora aircraft that has been reported is, it may be disinformation, and Linda hinted to that. A number of other people have hinted at that. One of the best ways to divert a person's attention, whether you're dealing with unexplained phenomena, which could be man-made, unexplained phenomena, which could be extraterrestrial, is the problems associated with disinformation. I think there's a lot of stuff that have come out that leads you in that direction. One of the items that made me a believer that there's something out there besides man-made objects is a letter from Ben R. Rich. Now, those of you who are familiar with Lockheed, familiar with the Skunk Works, the man who succeeded Kelly Johnson, his name is Ben Rich. And Ben and I have been, not friends, but respected associates or whatever for the last 15 to 18 years because of my involvement with the Blackbird. He wrote a letter, John Andrews from the Tester Corporation, who wanted to do the best stealth kit possible, wrote a letter to Ben Rich saying that he'd heard rumors that Monogram was going to be getting drawings for the F-117, which we referred to as the F-19 back then. And the letter also asked Ben if he'd comment on UFOs. Ben sent back to John Andrews, and I've seen the original letter, and I have a photocopy of the original letter, and I compared signatures, and I've known John 20 years. A real letter. Ben Rich says, in the question, do you believe in UFOs? The comment from Ben Rich on his own stationery, signed, and this was President, Lockheed Advanced Development Programs, Division of Lockheed, California. Yes, they do exist. Both Kelly Johnson and I are firm believers in UFOs. Then it went on to talk about the Monogram request, and Ben discounted that. Not satisfied with that response, John Andrews responded the next day to Ben Rich and said, please clarify your position. We have two categories of UFOs. We have both man-made and extraterrestrial. Less than 4 days later, in a handwritten letter, again on his stationery, Ben says, I'm firm believers in both categories. We refer to them as unfunded opportunities, and he underlines UFO. He went in to talk a little bit about the UFOs, but in the very last paragraph he said we believe that, he said there are both man-made and extraterrestrial UFOs flying, is in essence what he said, but his very last comment was, beware. There are a lot of people out there that will do you harm and they will deceive you. Just be very sure of when you're digging up information that you know where your sources are coming from. And one of the problems that John and I have found, both John Lear and John Andrews and myself, is a lot of the information that we start talking about goes full circle and comes back to us. And you're getting so-called verified information that you started or that you asked a question about, and it's come back to you in the form of a response to your initial question. So it's something that we really have to be careful with. There are activities out in the Nevada desert that are unexplained. On December 13th, 1989, John Andrews from Tester Corporation, Mike Dornheim, who is the West Coast editor for Aviation Week, and myself were aware, just from conversations we had with Bob Lazar and John Lear, that Wednesday nights are very active nights in the Nevada desert. It was about 20 degrees out, full moon. It was cold in the Dickens, but the sky was as clear as I've ever seen the desert sky. We left Tonopah approximately 10:30 that night after spending the day at the fence line at Tonopah photographing 117s. Drove to Warm Springs and decided we were going to try to find a back road to the northern perimeter of the Groom Lake test facility. We went down this one road just out of Warm Springs for about 35 miles. We're in the middle of absolutely nowhere. We're 70 miles from the closest building, and we got a flat tire. I hit a sharp rock and it ripped the tire out. So we're out there trying to figure out where the spare was. We found the spare. We couldn't find where the jack was. We figured we could drive all the way back to Tonopah on the rim. But we're just sitting out here just watching the sky. In 1 hour's time, we counted between John Andrews, Mike Dornheim, and myself over 80 very, very large, what appears to be meteor re-entries, all coming into the same direction. Which we were north of Groom Lake, and everything that we were seeing was south of us, coming in on an angle like so. We thought that was extremely unusual. There was, as I did some research a little bit later, there was a scheduled meteor shower during that time frame, but it's, I think, 1 or 2 an hour is what they report are visible. This was almost 100 in an hour. I think 75, 78 total. We thought that was phenomenal. We stayed out there and just observed the sky for an additional hour, and the meteors stopped. We did find the jack and headed back to town. Mike Dornheim felt that was really unusual. I felt it was unusual, and so did John Andrews. We didn't see anything else that night, even though there were some reports out near Rachel of unexplained activities. On February 4th of this year, John Lear and I decided we were going to go out and see if we can get a good vantage point of Groom Lake, see what was there. John took the original photographs that were shown in the George Knapp tape and the Fox tape of the panoramic view of the flight line at Groom Lake. He took those in September of '78. In the original photographs, you can see MiG-21s, you can see older aircraft, support aircraft, but you don't see anything that you can't explain. And we felt that the construction, there wouldn't be all that much construction over the last 12, 13 years wrong. As we got to the top of the mountain, we had driven down the Groom Lake Dirt Road to about mile 13, turned off as a turnaround point, and then went down a dirt path down through a canyon. And John has a 4x4 Jimmy pickup truck. On his front windshield, he has a bumper sticker, but on his windshield it says Area 51 Visitors Permit. It's blue with white letters, a little UFO on one end. And I'm really out of shape. I mean, I'm 47 years old. I'm fat. I don't work out. I don't smoke, so my lungs are in fairly good shape. We decided we're going to hike up the top of this mountain. I have a 50-pound or 60-pound pack on my back because there's no water, there's no food, and we figure we may be up there for a day and a half. I have my cameras back there. John has his binoculars, and we hike up this mountain. John would have bet just 100 to 1 I'd never make it, but we did. We got to the first vantage point that he'd been to before, where you can just see just the south end of the lake bed and the runway area, the POL area, and some of the south support buildings in the area called Baja. And we finally caught our breath. I decided I was going to go up and see if I can get a little bit better vantage point. And I went up another 400 to 500 feet vertical, and it was about another 3/4 of a mile up the side of the mountain, and got to a mountain peak. It's called Whitesides. And on the very top of this peak is a little medallion from the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in 1948, indicating that's the highest point in the valley. And we sat up there and we had a complete panoramic view of Groom Lake. John was dumbfounded. The facility had tripled or quadrupled in size since 1978. There's a manufacturing production facility that is identical to and the same size, color, and construction as the B2 production facility at Palmdale at Site 4. It's, for those who are familiar with the photograph, it's due west of the original A-12 hangars and just south of the water tower. There was a arch-shaped hangar facility, sort of centralized in the middle of the base, which we believe it's an indoor radar range. SBS-13 antenna that was visible in the original photograph is still there with a complementary antenna just to the north of it. And we watched the facility for 6.5 hours. We saw the E&G 737s come in, take off, support aircraft come in and go out. And the B-2 was doing flyovers. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, John says, "Can you see that?" And I looked out. It wasn't a UFO, mind you. I looked out, and about 15 miles due west of us, to the northwest of the lake bed, was a rotating antenna that we could see with our naked eye. John has some very, very powerful binoculars. They're about so long. I don't know what the power of them are, but they're beautiful. The Bosch and Lomb is very expensive and very, very precise. So we threw the binoculars on there, and here was a radar antenna that looked like a beam use antenna. It was a gridded metal structure, open, approximately 150 feet tall, 400 to 500 feet wide, rotating at 1 revolution every 15 seconds. Now, I've asked a lot of people who are in the air fans and radar business. No one's ever heard of American or Soviet-built radar that big. You can see the cars, but the cars were insignificant in size. Again, you could see this radar unit 15 miles away with the unaided eye as it rotated. And that's what caught our attention, because you could see it was metal, and you could see the glint off the sun. So we watched it. I made some verbal notes on my tape recorder. Took some panoramic views of Groom Lake. And those of you who saw the NBC special Monday before last, that showed a view of Groom Lake, those are my photographs. John and I shot them, and John sent one of the photographs to NBC. Mine disappeared in the mail. I have another set coming, but they conveniently disappeared for whatever reason. At 2:05 p.m. on February 4th, John and I are sitting having a can of pop, and all of a sudden I hear whoop, 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 and John says, "Uh-oh, the Blackhawks are coming." And sure enough, European lizard camouflaged Blackhawk helicopter flying at terrain following mode came from Groom Lake over the mountains, and he's going like so, and came up and over the top of our mountain. And I have a tape recording of it, and basically what I said, we're in some shit now, because I didn't know what they were going to do, if there was an assault team or whatever. So they came up and over, and kept on going. They didn't see us because we were in the backside of the mountain. They went down the canyon, and they hovered over John's truck. And I'm saying, well, they can sure see your bumper sticker from there, which would give us permission to be here. The Wackenhut security people, those are the people who maintain the security at the Groom Lake test facility, were out there on the road. And we knew we were in trouble because they kept pointing up to the mountain. And what we think, there's no sensors up there, but I think what they got a glint off of either my telephoto or off of John's binoculars, because no one's supposed to be up there, isn't supposed to be anything shining up there. So we decided we were going to pack up and head down. It's a lot easier going down than going up. And then we got down, the Lincoln County Sheriff were waiting for us. And he said, I see some identification, so gave him identification again. He said, and he looked at John's driver's license. I know you. And yeah, he wasn't aware who I was, but he did take all the information down. And he said, the reason we're out here is that Mr. Melton, or Mellon, who is the rancher in the area, was concerned because a couple weeks earlier someone had shot up one of his water troughs with a .22, and he was coming out here to make sure that we weren't doing the same thing. And in the back of my mind, and I didn't say anything, the man is so powerful of a rancher that he gets a military Black Hawk helicopter to come out and buzz us. But while we were still on top of the mountain, John and I were packing everything. We didn't want the helicopter crew to see us with cameras. So we packed them back into my backpack. And as they were coming back up the mountain, there was a guy hanging out, a GI, or at least he had green BDUs, fatigues, hanging out the helicopter door with appeared to be a Nikon with a motor drive with a lens about so big, about so wide. I figured it had to be a 1,000 millimeter 2.8. John and I just smiled and waved at him. And then we started heading down. From that point on, the amount of people that have been out there, I think Geraldo Rivera went out there to do some special. Well, it really just upset the hell out of the feds, and they have since harassed everybody that's gone up there. They have threatened anyone who's gone up there with prison. That if you're by yourself, you're being charged with a misdemeanor. They're confiscating your camera equipment, your video equipment, and your film. This is the county sheriff, mind you. Supposedly, when I talked to the Attorney General's office, Attorney General Barr for the U.S., he said that the county officers are operating under the direction of federal authorities. But it's still illegal seizure of personal property. If you were in a group with more than 2 people, they're charging you with espionage or threatening to charge you with espionage. They're not being very, very kind. And my feeling is the Cold War is over. We don't have a defined enemy. Why would the federal government go to such lengths to harass its citizens if there was nothing to be concerned about? If we don't have an enemy, and we haven't had an enemy for a long time. Colin Powell, in addressing the chairman of the House Appropriation Committee, said up to 5 years ago they knew that the Soviet Union was disintegrating and that they weren't going to be a military threat. Yet there are activities out in the Nevada desert that they just assume shoot you for. And one of them is the Groom Lake Test Facility. Since the visit that John and I made out there, George Knapp he used to be with KLAS Channel 8 in Las Vegas. He has since quit. He's done some consulting work for someone else, but decided to champion the cause of a couple of photographers who had their equipment confiscated by the Lincoln County Sheriff. And about 2 weeks ago, went out there with a film team, much like a 60-minute team, with a concealed video camera, going into the sheriff's office there in Alamo, Nevada, demanding the equipment be returned, asking under whose authority was the equipment confiscated, and the fact that they were going to go to Whitesides Mountain and observe Groom Lake, and what are you going to do about it? Now, I haven't talked to John Lear or Bob Knapp, George Knapp since then, so I don't know what happened or what transpired, but I'm sure something happened. But to get back to the Nevada desert and Aurora and things that go bump in the night, Lockheed just shipped off something in February or late January, which was the last item to be shipped out of the Skunk Works. Sherm Mullen, who replaced Ben Rich as president of the Skunk Works, called all the Lockheed people together, all the Skunk Works people together, and said that those of you who are concerned about the diminishing defense dollar, that you're concerned about your job, never fear. We have enough in the pipeline already funded for or already built to keep everyone in this building employed for the rest of their natural lives. That leads me to believe that Lockheed is one of the key players in the Aurora, or whatever you want to call it, and Lockheed is a key player in a number of other black programs. When they had this NBC special, they got hold of Colonel Tony Tolan, who used to be the commander of the F-117 operation out of Tonopah, and he originally was at Groom Lake before that. He's now a brigadier general, and his comment was, we have a number of black programs that are flying and have been funded, and they're well thought out and they're cost effective. Tom Long made a comment that says, well, when you mention it's cost effective, it must have meant they really went over budget, because they wouldn't have mentioned cost if they hadn't. But there are a number of black programs flying out there. The designation TR-3 has been kicked around as a reconnaissance version of some type of aircraft. A friend of mine who works at the Pentagon at the National Reconnaissance Center had indicated to me that TR-3 is a real designation. but it's not necessarily something built by Northrop. Some other people have indicated that the TR-3 is a tactical reconnaissance version of the F-117, a different airframe, but an F-117 being used in a tactical reconnaissance mode. There's also a program that's been flying since 1982 out of the Nevada Test Range facility at Groom Lake called Excalibur. Excalibur is a low observable electronic warfare aircraft used to complement the not the F-117, the F-111, EF-111 Raven, and the EAB-6 Prowler the Navy flies. I believe it has gone operational, or is going operational. I don't believe, based on the information I had, that it was used in Desert Storm. The other small tidbit I have as far as what's happening in the Nevada desert, I plan on going back to Holloman to photograph the F-117 and do another story on the ground operations. And when I was talking to the program security officer, I said, do I need permission to come out here? Do I have to write Colonel Alton Whitley, who is the current commander of the 37th Fighter Wing? Said, no, Colonel Whitley is not coming to Tonopah. Is not leaving Tonopah. He's going to stay at Tonopah to fly another program. Well, they're telling the world that Tonopah is closing. I think they're telling the world that Tonopah is closing to divert attention. It's too far for anyone to go out there just to look at an empty base. But if they think it's empty, they can start flying whatever out there. I have any questions?
Mention the activities at Beale.
They have been F-117s at Beale. Some lights that were shown were reported. If you take the ratio of the lights, the width and the length, it could have been a U-2R in trouble, and he had his formation lights on, and the two T-38s were flying in formation just to aid the aircraft down. The other thing is, if indeed there are operations out of Tonopah, and one way to divert your attention from Tonopah to some other location is to start talking about strange phenomena or strange activities or unusual aircraft flying out of Beale. Beale is known to have supported the SR-71, which is a unique aircraft. It requires special fuels, special supply lines, your physiological support division, your suit, and aerospace support people are all specialized. It would be a prime base for that type of operation. So it could be a diversion of attention from Tonopah to some other location, drop people off. Yes, sir?
Do you have an opinion on William Cooper at all?
No, I don't. No. Yes, sir?
Do you know anything about reports coming out of Antelope Valley, California?
Yes, I had a couple phone calls about 2 or 3 years ago, and said, have you heard about Northrop's facility out of the Antelope Valley? And initially it didn't sink in until I realized that 3 or 4 different I thought that 3 or 4 different locations were separate. They turned out to be all the same location. Northrop does have a facility. It's a radar signature range on the west end of the Antelope Valley. I believe if you go out, I think it's Road C or Avenue C, or Avenue A, and you head due west, you can't go any farther. You'll see a road going into the facility. The runway is only about 8,000 feet, and it's not a real wide runway, and the hangar facility is relatively small. There's a lot of support aircraft going in and out of there, but there were rumors that there were strange lights and strange sounds. It's my belief that all it is a radar range operated by Northrop that you can view from the air. You can fly west of US 14, and you can see the facility, and it's nothing that they're going to shoot you down for. You can't overfly it, but it's not a real spooky facility. There isn't anything. A couple people have snuck up on, gone through the back way. From the southeast side, you can't see the facility because it's a sort of a small little mountain or hill in between. But if you go coming in from the northeast, you can see the facility, and it isn't an impressive facility. It's something that's relatively new, but it's nothing compared to Tonopah or Groom Lake. Yes?
Jim, could you comment also on your impression, your friendship with John Lear? Back about 4 years ago, he authored the hypotheses of the UFO situation that was very controversial, still controversial today. Much of mainstream, quote unquote, the conservative elements of ufology have effectively divorced John Lear from their viewpoint. Could you tell us, audience, your impressions about John Lear?
Well, I've known John Lear about 15 years. When I first met him, the last thing in the world he believed in was UFOs. John Andrews started giving him some information. John Lear started digging into it and really started finding out more and more until he became a firm believer. About 4 years ago, John Lear called me up. He was on the road. I'm not sure what part of the country he was in, but he was flying for American Transair at the time. And he was shook up. His voice was quivering. And he said, Jim, I can't discuss it on the telephone. Maybe if we get together in Las Vegas, I can. But if you have something you want to do in your life, you have about 5 years to do it. I said, what do you mean? He says, I can't say any more. So about 6 months later, I ended up in Las Vegas, and I said, what were you talking about? I believe it's the same thing you're referring to. It's John's firm feeling, and he still won't tell me where he got his information, and John has never lied to me. He can be a real goofball sometimes, and sometimes you don't know if he's serious or not. But he is sincere, and the man was scared. Mara Lee, his wife, was scared. John got to the point where he made a video will, not necessarily a will, but a documentary that he was going to have distributed to a lot of people in case something happened to him. He knew that he was going to be killed. Mary Lee felt so threatened by what John was saying and what was happening in the Las Vegas area. When John was on one of his road trips, Mary Lee had all his documentation, we're talking about filing cabinets, big ones, removed from the house. And wouldn't tell John where they were for about 3 months. All his books, all his resources, had the phones changed. And told John that he was forbidden to tell anyone his phone number except those people that he knew, because so many strange people were starting to get hold of him. But John still is a firm believer that that there's going to be I don't know if it's a mass landing, an invasion, an appearance, may be a proper word for it, soon, and that we're at risk. He said, how to have something for dinner. That's not the proper etiquette on serving meals. It's how to cook you for dinner, and that's one of his fears, and it's genuine. He's not. It's not something that he's a rational man. He has been everywhere. He flew for Air America. He's not afraid of a lot of things, but he is terrified, and I don't think for himself. I think for everyone involved, all of us in this room, everyone on the earth.
When approximately was this supposed to take place?
If I recall, we're looking at 1993, 1994 time frame. And it may even be this year. But it was, at the time that John called me, he was very, very upset. And it was very obvious that he was terrified. He was scared. And he never really divulged how he got that information or how it all came to him. I haven't really sat down and dug into it. Again, my background, my love affair is with the hardware versus the human or the extraterrestrial element. Yes, sir.
Speaking of hardware, what have you heard on crash retrievals?
It goes back a long, long way, but I have heard through Air Force sources. I work for a two-star general, Wayne C. Gatlin, who's now retired with 41 years as a fighter pilot. We talked about UFOs. There has been a number of retrievals. They have what they refer to as the Alien Technology Center, supposedly near or around the Groom Lake facility, where they have tested, where they brought in crashed vehicles. I'd say I haven't really got into any depth into it. One of the things that have come out over the years, and it was really not through a UFO source or an aviation source, but it was a gentleman who was a researcher at DuPont had indicated. I was doing some business with DuPont a number of years ago, and we were talking about a lot of different things, a lot of technology. And he said, do you know the true origin of Kevlar? And I said, no, it took you guys a long time to develop it. And he says, just keep your eyes open, because it wasn't developed here. And that's all he would say. And later on, I heard some rumblings that Kevlar was a reversed engineered product that was recovered out of the original crash site in 1947. That they took the material, and it took DuPont 15 years or 18 years to reverse engineer the product.
I was trying to ask Mark Cadence some questions about this, and he just absolutely poo-pooed the whole thing. He doesn't seem to be interested in breaking secrecy.
Well, I don't feel I've been exposed to, I don't have access to secret information. I have talked with a lot of people over the years. I've traveled all over the country for almost 20 years. And I spent a lot of time at military installations, and I think everyone's aware of what my interests are, primarily unexplained phenomena, either aircraft and/or UFOs. The Russians have reported to have recovered aircraft. There's been crashes all over the world that have been reported to have been retrieved, and the hardware brought to a central location. But I haven't, I don't have, John Lehr may be able to have some information on that. I have no direct involvement in that, other than I have heard through relatively reliable sources that hardware has been recovered over the years. The example of the 9 vehicles that Bob Lazar saw is a prime example that we do have vehicles. The letter from Ben Rich says, yes, we have the UFOs, both man-made and the other being extraterrestrial. Would indicate, yes, that those vehicles have been recovered. As early as 1972, I heard one of the areas identified in the Groom Lake Test Facility was the Alien Technology Center, and that was not for the study of illegal aliens coming across the California border either. It was for someone other than that. So I'd have to say that we do have an active program, and 4 or 5 different sources, one being Ben Rich, who I can't dispute his level of involvement in high tech, has said the same thing. Yes, sir.
And can you comment on the large Batwing aircraft or whatever they are that are being seen in California, and that apparently we're seeing in the Hudson Valley in the mid-70s?
In the 1970s, out of Groom Lake, the B-2 bomber did not take off and fly in its very, very first flight in 1988, early 89. They had technology demonstrators flying that design. It's very possible, but unlikely they'd fly it out of the Nevada test range, but they may have flown a subscale prototype of the B-2 outside of the Nevada test range in the mid-70s, because they were doing feasibility studies on a tailless aircraft of the B-2 design prior to the first flight of the B-2. They had an airplane. Northrop had an airplane that Lockheed called Shamu, which was it looked like a C-97 from the side, sort of roundish nose, a bat wing, probably a platform very, very similar to the B-2. If you look at a C-97 from the side and a B-2 from the side, it does have the same type of round upper fuselage, a real small tail that was really insignificant. Until they got their flight computers fine-tuned, they probably did want to fly with some type of tail. But it could have been that vehicle that was seen. Lockheed said that Northrop had a lot of trouble with it. The engines were embedded within the wing, and the only reason the Lockheed people were allowed to see the aircraft was because they asked Lockheed if they could bring their C-130 out, put it in front of this, they refer to as Shamu, turn the engines on full blast with the brakes on to get more air flowing through the inlets and over the wing to get the engine started. So it could have been that vehicle in the mid-1970s. Yes, ma'am.
You talked a lot about the fear that's generated by this subject, people being afraid for their lives and being threatened. Phone calls, we've heard that throughout the whole conference, really. I want to know if you personally have been threatened.
No, I haven't. I've had my mail opened. I've had my phones tapped. I've had my neighbors talked to. I believe Pete Ames and the people in Special Projects and the people at Nellis Air Force Base feel that it would take an awful lot to scare me. In 1986, I underwent brain surgery, and I came to terms with myself. And if everything would end today, it wouldn't bother me. I've lived a good life, so I'm not afraid of idle threats. If some guy would put a gun to my head and I knew he was unstable, then I would fear for my life. But I'm not afraid of dying, and that may be why they haven't challenged me. I haven't dug into it as deep as I wasn't part of it like Bob Lazar, or dug into it like John Lear or some other people, because I'm on the hardware end of it more so than the alien end of it. But I know there's a real major fear out there. A good example, in 1978, I'm currently in the Air National Guard. I'm a historian with the Minnesota Air Guard right now, but my background is communications. And in 1978, I was, after a conversation with John Andrews from Tester, I had met a gentleman there who was in security service for 11 years, who was a communications specialist, spent time in Turkey, spent time at Medina site near San Antonio, which is supposedly an underground facility. And I mentioned something about N like in November, J12, and he said, no, it's M like in Michael, M like in magic. And we started talking, and he had a lot of insight into unexplained phenomena, Operation Blue Book. I said, well, why did they cancel Blue Book? He said, you don't know? And I said, that's why I'm asking you. He said, they did either one of two things. They proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that UFOs did not exist, or they do. I said, well, if they do exist, why does the military or the government deny the fact that we have captured UFOs? I said, if we know what they are no longer unidentified. So they could be telling you the truth. In 1985, John Lear came into town, into Minneapolis, and I talked to John about this one person, never mentioned him by name, and I said, you two have to get together, because you know the questions to ask, I don't. Would you like to get hold of him? Would you like for me to set up a meeting? And John said, I'd love to. So I called this gentleman up. He's a school teacher. He has a master's degree in literature. Very well read. Very comfortable in who he is. Called him up and said, this is Jim Goodall. I said, can we get together? He said, sure. So I met him in his school, and I said, I have a friend of mine coming into town. He'd love to meet you. He'd love to sit down and talk about MJ-12, your involvement with some operations out of Turkey, and UFOs in general. Would you be willing to talk with him? He said, no problem. So he'll be in next week. So John flew in. We went out, picked up this guy at a pre-designated location. We started driving towards, we were going to determine where we were going to go when we got into the car. This way no one knew, no one could pre-plan, there wouldn't be a setup somewhere. And we all agreed that we were going to go to a Perkins down in the south suburb of Minneapolis. As we're driving, this guy starts getting real weird. And Johnny asked him a question, and he says, stop for a second. He says, I'm not going to lose my life, lose my job, lose everything I have for you. Please take me home. Someone had gotten to him from the time I talked to him at school until we got in the car and we were heading towards Perkins Restaurant. He was shook. Someone got to him and told him that you will not talk to John Lear. You will not divulge what you know, what you may know. And he wasn't the type of guy that was easily intimidated. He was a big guy. Again, someone got to him and said he wasn't going to risk his life, his family, or his future to divulge what he knew, or he wasn't going to talk about it. And we took him home. I haven't talked to him since. Yep.
As a quick follow-up, what about John Lear? Do you know that he has personally been through?
Yes. He's not so much now, because John and I met, we were together again in February, and I asked him, are you still fearing for your life? And his comment was, not at this time. But back 4 or 5 years ago, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, he knew that was the end. He came to terms with Mary Lee and his 2 children. They accepted the fact that he may disappear. Now, one of John's philosophies, and the same with mine, and I believe the English lady, Jenny, last night mentioned, you know something, you tell everybody you know. Because the one thing they can't stifle if you discover something, you dig up something, keep it to yourself. Well, I'm going to keep this as a tidbit. The only person they got to eliminate or to remove is you. But as soon as you have something, as soon as you have some documentation, you have something that you can prove that this event happened, you give it to as many people as you can, because they can't approach everybody. They won't. There's only a finite number of them. There's a heck of a lot more of us than there are them, as far as the people that are trying to control us.
I was wondering if you might want to comment on the X-30, or perhaps the crash that just happened about a week ago, the 22 or 23?
It was the F-22. It was on a, I got called Saturday after, was it Saturday afternoon, Tony?
Yeah.
No, I was asking my girlfriend up there. She got the phone call. The F-22 was doing a public relations flyby for NBC television, a la the XB-70. And it had done 2 touch and goes successfully, gear up, full burner, go around doing some flybys or whatever. The 3rd touch and go was very, very hard. It may have been a flaw or something wrong with the software, but the airplane came down exceptionally hard. The aircraft bounced up, the pilot retracted the gear, and about that same time, the control surfaces started going up and down. He started waffling up and down. The airplane did hit tail first, slammed the nose down. The cockpit was jammed, he couldn't open it manually, so the pilot blew the canopy and he walked out of the aircraft. It burnt for 35 minutes. It was a total write-off. Monday they didn't report, they had, in the Monday in the Antelope Valley Times, they said there was a landing incident of the only flyable F-22 at Edwards Air Force Base on Saturday, and then on Tuesday the truth came out that it had been a total write-off.
Follow-up is, you said you're interested in communication more than a lot of other events. Are you familiar with the communication of NASA, that perhaps there's this little secret language they have for astronauts where they...
Well, on a number of different occasions, on one of the shuttle flights, there was an indication of an unknown, unexplained object following or being observed by the space shuttle, and they immediately went into, on a non-classified mission, went into an encrypted transmission. And I believe, it's my belief that a lot of the space missions have been been observed, or that they have observed unexplained phenomena. They don't talk about it. The other thing that's really interesting, and I was sitting down with John Andrews and John Lear and Bob Lazar. We were talking about shortly after Challenger blew up. If you recall, during about a 15-month period, every launch vehicle in the world was out of service for about 15 months. The French Ariane aircraft or rocket was down for technical problems. The Soviets were blowing up proton rockets or whatever, it was right and left. Our Titan IVs blew up Vandenberg. Virtually all the launch vehicles we had in the world were out of service for about 15 months. One of the hypotheses is that powers being on our control, we're making sure that they weren't observed during a certain period of time, and that's one of the reasons why the launch vehicles were put out of service. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Groom Lake, is that all funded by our taxes?
Well, I think everything that you see is funded by our taxes. The Groom Lake Test Facility, when I mentioned to Lanny Jenkins from Lockheed, Lockheed Plant 10, I said, would you like to have a panoramic photograph taken recently of Groom Lake? He said, yeah, I'd love it. I said, a lot of construction there, isn't there? I said, yes, sir. He says, more to come. If you look at the black budgets for the last, since 1979, 1980, we have spent in unaccountable funding in black appropriations on the average of 12 to $15 billion a year since 1979. And 1993 budget is still a $14 billion line item. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just kind of a question, being an election year and stuff. We've got a senator here in Nebraska who's on the Armed Services Committee. Let's just say you're in a press conference. Is there a question you could pose to someone like him to get him to talk about some of these black budgets and some of these bases and things that he's, I'm sure, aware of, such as water and things that they can't wiggle out of in a press conference besides just saying it's.
Well, he can be a politician and just do what politicians do and just double talk. If you'll think back a ways, former President Jimmy Carter was a UFO fanatic and not fanatic, but a supporter of unexplained phenomena. And one of his charters when he became president, he was going to release everything the government had on UFOs. He became president and nothing. He doesn't even talk about it. Barry Goldwater had a UFO organization that he formed, he sponsored, he was behind. All of a sudden, he was pulled aside and he denied the existence of the organization he founded. I believe the fear factor, which has been brought up time and time and again, is the controlling factor behind people in power, people who have the ability, with the exception of people like Bob Lazar, who's going to risk it all. I mean, he risked everything. He lost his career for the benefit of you and I, for us to be informed. I think Senator Exxon has been briefed well enough, and I believe any senator that's in the know has been briefed well enough that the consequences for release of this data are more than they're willing to pay.
I'm curious, you're talking about
It's on.
you're talking about the budget for your black, for your black budget. Now, does that go into, what's your opinion on, say, like your pulsar laser, pulsars, lasers they're talking about, the golden pebbles deals they're talking about here?
That's not black. That's not part of a black budget.
But would the purpose of research and technology have anything to do for our governments in the world where we're an outside invasion coming in? There be any connection and speculation there?
President Reagan, on at least 3 occasions, and former Soviet President Gorbachev said after the Keflavik meeting that Star Wars could be aimed outward as a possible shield against invasion from alien beings. I mean, that is documented, that's recorded. Marlon Fitzwater has a copy of that, of a number of talks or speeches that President Reagan gave stating that specific item. So Star Wars could be, and it's my belief that with 58 nations actively involved in it, funding still actively being pursued on Star Wars, that it's not a shield to protect us against an invasion of what was left of the Soviet Union. Yes, sir?
You mentioned the TR3. Is there a TR1 too?
Well, TR1 is the U2R. U2R TR1 made by Lockheed. There are a number of aircraft out there that they will build a technology demonstrator. It will go by the wayside and they'll use the number up. Like the A9. The A9 was built by Northrop. The A10 by Fairchild. The AV-8A was by McDonnell Douglas and British Aerospace. There may have been a proposal and a fly-off between the TR2 and a TR3 for tactical reconnaissance aircraft. The designation TR3, from what I've been told through sources in the Pentagon, is a real designation, but not necessarily what you think it is. It isn't that Northrop thing that was shown in Aviation Week. Yes, sir?
I've heard stories about so-called stealth helicopters where the chopper can actually cut its sound and you can't hardly hear, and you can barely hear the whisper of the rotors. Have you found any evidence that such objects?
During the original the Persian Gulf War, we had, not what Saddam Hussein, but prior to that, when Iran was sinking tankers in the Persian Gulf, they had some specially modified OH-58s, which you physically could not hear if they're directly above you. They have gotten to the point where they have lowered the audible signature of the rotors to that of just a whisper, and that of the engines to just it has to be right over you for you to hear it. So yes, they have gone through and stealthized. Stealth is more than just visible. Stealth is a visible. Correction. Stealth is more than just radar. It's visible signature, it's infrared signature, it's audible signature, it's contrail, a number of other different items. Thank you. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Now, Jim is going to be out in the